Stories aimed at an audience of women and girls love to retell fairy tales. In the past 20 or 30 years, fairy tale retellings have appeared as adult fantasy novels, as children's and young adult novels, as fantasy film, and as whatever was going on with teen movies in the late 90s and early 2000s. Obviously, it was part of this greater movement to make chick flicks out of the canon, but, why? So, to return to my point, we like to take an old wives' tale and turn it into a new wives' tale. I'm workshopping that. Which makes sense. Fairy tales are a group of stories that your audience is pretty likely to already be familiar with. They frequently feature female characters, and they happen to already conveniently be in the public domain, so you don't get in trouble for retelling them. So a reasonable place to start if you want to start telling stories aimed at a female audience. There was a time in my life I read near exclusively YA fantasy. It was a dark time. So I've read upwards to maybe hundreds of retold fairy tales, definitely dozens, although I have forgotten many of their names because they were not all very memorable. In order to adapt to a modern audience and offer a fresh perspective, often retellings try to be subversive or feminist or both. Now, many of these stories are effective, well-written works that I really enjoy. Some of them are fine, a handful are abjectly terrible, but as a fairy tale connoisseur, self-diagnosed, I think that a lot of retellings, while they might not be bad books, and I'm not really comfortable calling a book bad in the first place, but I digress. Many retellings, even when they're not bad books, aren't necessarily as subversive as they think they are. Sometimes they even wind up being less feminist than the very old, very patriarchal texts that they were based on, and I would like to explain how and why I think so. So how do modern retellings attempt to subvert the fairy tale? Or to narrow it down, how do they attempt to subvert the fairy tale heroine? I mean, obviously I'm going to be making generalizations here because, like I said, retellings are a trend that appear in a broad genre of works, and I don't really want to hunt down individual examples to use as case studies. But broadly speaking, especially when focusing on fantasy books, both YA and otherwise, here are some trends that I've noticed in the female main characters of work that is attempting to be subversive. The first is a focus on the female perspective, motivations, emotional life, and the like. A lot of these books are romances, or they contain a central romantic arc, and I think that's a way for the author to prioritize the female main character's emotional interiority. The second is a loud, headstrong, or feisty personality for the protagonist, as opposed to a more timid, quiet personality. The third is an element of physical prowess, like hand-to-hand fighting, or skill in magic, or often archery for some reason, because I guess archery is seen as more feminine or dainty. No one tells these authors what the draw weight of a longbow is. All three of these elements point to an attempt to balance out what the idea of a traditional fairy tale heroine is. We need a woman who's feisty, competent, and knows what she wants in order to contrast a woman who's timid, passive, and sidelined in her own story. The anti-heroine, if you will. Not like, that sounds like I'm saying anti-hero. I'm not saying anti-hero. I'm saying like the anti-fairy tale heroine. So stories have always changed with the times in order to reflect the changing perspectives of the people who tell them and the cultures they live in. This is especially true for myths and folklore because it was originally transmitted orally, so it was able to be shaped by the whole community and not just by individuals. So considering that, maybe what I'm calling a failure to subvert might just be the times have changed. It's reflecting the culture we now live in. And while I think that's a factor, I think a bigger factor is that, well, a subversion is inherently trying to be the opposite of the thing it's subverting. And when you look at the inverse of a retelling protagonist, like I said, you get a woman who's timid and incapable and passive. And that's not a woman who's easy to find in many actual fairy tales. That's an early Disney princess. And I don't say this to dismiss those early Disney characters. They are movies that I really like, and I really do disagree with this idea that they're pathetic or poor role models or whatever else people were writing think pieces about in 2015. But early Disney princesses did tend to be limited to a very specific archetype of femininity in personality and in temperament and in physical appearance. Even, or especially actually, when you compare early Disney princesses to later ones. And this makes sense. Like, if you're currently alive and in the position to write books, you probably at least saw a Disney movie. Probably many of them, back to back on VHS, like yours truly. Your mental understanding of what a fairy tale is and how a fairy tale works would then have been influenced by Disney, whether you realize it or not. Even if you were also exposed to real fairy tales. Disney is an enormous cultural influence, and it just shaped how a lot of people conceive fairy tales mentally. actually. I'm thinking about like BuzzFeed listicles that will be like, the messed up origins of this Disney film, so surprisingly dark, you'll be shocked by how edgy it is. But if you have been exposed to fairy tales from a young age, this darkness and edginess isn't really shocking. And honestly, as a child, they didn't even seem that dark to me. Because as a child, you're already learning so much about the world that seems dark or wrong or unjust or nonsensical. And you just have to take it at face value because sometimes things in the world are unjust and nonsensical. So when I was like 9 and I read the part in Anderson's The Rose Elf where this girl puts her lover's decapitated head in a flower pot, I was like, huh, that's messed up. But also, I've just learned about, I don't know, deforestation, so I guess messed up is just how things in the world are. Or maybe I was just a weird kid and this is not a common line of thought. I don't know. Let me know. Anyway, so many fairy tale retellings want to subvert fairy tales, but wind up subverting Disney because the fairy tale traits have been garbled along the way, like a game of telephone. It's kind of ironic because, like I said, retellings are trying to be feminist, but early Disney movies were primarily written and produced and animated by men. Like, women weren't allowed to be animators, they were only allowed to be colorists. So they were stories created by men. By contrast, the word old wives' tale exists for a reason, even though it doesn't literally mean fairy tale. It has a different connotation, but you get the point. Fairy tales were often women's stories told to and by women. Grimm's, for example, were edited and collected by the brothers Grimm, but the sources they collected from were often female. But if we take Disney's influence into account, then the reason fairy tales aren't really succeeding at being subversive isn't because there's something wrong with trying to tell women's stories or focusing on a women's perspective, it's because they don't know what they're talking about. They're not familiar enough with the source to be making accurate criticism. You can't argue against something you don't actually know or understand. So because of this, I would like to go even further back than the 1930s and see what some fairy tale heroines were up to back in the day. I'm going to be talking mostly about Grimm's unless I specify otherwise. The stories are very biased by the Grimm brothers' very Victorian mores, which have a very distinct flavor to them. Like, the Victorians were freaks, but Grimm's are more familiar to me, they're more likely to be familiar to an English-speaking audience, and Disney adopted quite a few of them, so it's a good, like, point of comparison, like a control group. So kind of zooming out from just the fairy tale heroine into the plots of the fairy tales, what plot features are considered sexist and thus attempted to subvert? There are two big ones that I've noticed most often. One is marriage at the end of the story, which is super common, fairy tale ending. Fairy tale ending is sometimes used as a synonym for successful marriage or successful romance. Disney parks actually sell this like feature or thing called a fairy tale wedding where they fly you out and you can do your wedding at Disney. I don't know why you would or how you would have enough money, but you can do that anyway. When marriage is used as a narrative reward for making it through the story, it seems to imply that marriage is inherently a good thing, that women obviously want to be married. Maybe they should be married and they should be wives. People, understandably, tend to have an issue with this one. Two is the trope of the damsel in distress who must be rescued by a man or a male love interest. This trope can be objectifying. It removes from the female character both physical ability, she's stuck, she can't get out, and narrative agency, aka the ability to affect the story. But, objection. Both of these are definitely super common, but I don't think either of them are as sexist as they initially appear. For the marriage at the end, it is super common and it is treated as a reward, which I could totally understand having issue with. But this is true for both the fairy tales about women and the fairy tales about men. It was kind of a goal for everybody. These stories originated in pre-industrial societies. You kind of did have to get married. It was more entrenched in society. And in addition, there are also stories where marriage is acknowledged to be risky or dangerous to women, like Bluebeard, where a woman's husband is revealed to be a wife-murdering serial killer, or The Robber Bridegroom, where this woman doesn't like her fiancé, he's giving her bad vibes, and those bad vibes turn out to be completely justified because it turns out he is a murderous cannibal who wants to eat her. Honestly, calling him the robber bridegroom seems like a bit of an understatement. So while marriage is portrayed as a given, a social norm, there is also truck went by. There's also an understanding of the risks in marrying a cruel person and having to live under their power. They just hadn't reached the part yet where you don't necessarily have to do that. And for the damsel in distress, it is also very much present. When the protagonist of a story is a man, he does often have to save a woman and then marry her. 2 for 1. But the flip side is also true. There are fairy tales where the woman is the main character and she has to save her husband or brother or future husband who is a bear. or has been cursed to turn into a bear temporarily, and conveniently has a younger brother for her younger sister to marry because there are two sisters in this story. I love you, Snow White and Rose Red. Anyway, so men can be damsels. Mansels? I'm workshopping that too. And from what I understand, the origin of the loosely related, often overlapping trope of the princess who is stuck in a tower with a dragon and has to be rescued doesn't actually originate in fairy tales, but in medieval chivalric romances, which were also later a huge influence on modern fantasy. So it makes sense that wires kind of got crossed about where the trope came from. There are definitely princesses in towers, like Maid Maleen, but Maid Maleen was not a damsel. She climbed out of that tower herself, and then she went and found a job. No rescue required. I'm not really the most familiar with medieval literature, so take this one with a grain of salt. But point being, these two critiques don't really hold as much weight as they seem to, even though they're frequently the targets of criticism. So what did women in fairy tales actually do then? There's, of course, a lot of variation here, but there are fairy tales that grant their female characters some agency. I'm not a folklorist, so I'm sure I'm missing a ton of insight that would make this all even more fun to talk about, but I want to look at some of my favorite fairy tales and see what we can glean from them. So fairy tales across cultures tend to come in patterns or families that have similar plots and very likely branched from similar sources. One type that I particularly love is called the Search for the Lost Husband by the ATU index, so the ATU is an index that's used by folklorists to label and categorize fairy tales into categories and subcategories. The type I'm talking about is called the Search for the Lost Husband, bridegroom, whichever. It goes like this. So a woman is married to a man who appears in the shape of a monster or animal in the daytime, and then comes to her in the shape of a man at night for nighttime man activities. In many versions, she's actually pregnant in the second part of the story because of this. For some reason or another, usually by following the bad advice of a family member, she takes out the light at night and looks upon his sleeping face, which she had promised not to do, and afterwards he either flees or is taken away by some predetermined curse or bargain. So the heroine must go on a journey and face many trials to get her man back. General consensus on this one seems to be that it's based off of Cupid and Psyche. Beauty and the Beast is another really common variant. To be honest, I don't really like that one as much because it includes the animal bridegroom, but not the search for the lost husband, which I think is the more interesting part. My favorite version of this one is probably the Norwegian East of the Sun, West of the Moon, which was featured in Andrew Lang's Blue Fairy book. The husband is a polar bear in this one, and what will always make me mad is that Don Bluth was going to make a movie of this, and then it got stuck in development hell, and it was never produced, and I can't think about it for too long, otherwise I am filled with rage and melancholy. So the premise of the story type does see the main character kind of punished for disobeying her husband, which is a little iffy. I don't like that. But once you get past that, the husband-searching heroine is a very strong and active protagonist. She has a clear goal, she's driven, and she's kind of a reverse damsel. Her husband is the one that's in distress. There's also the ATU type, the brothers who turn into birds, or the brothers who were turned into birds, where there's some brothers and they get turned into birds. So their youngest sister must go out and complete some dangerous task in order to get them back. Tasks include taking a years-long vow of silence, or sewing them shirts made out of nettles, or cutting off her littlest finger to use as a key for the house they are in. Putting the Grimm in Grimm's. Grimm's has 3 of these in a row. The 6 swans, the 7 ravens, and the 12 brothers. Anderson also wrote a version which is essentially just a mishmash of all of the Grimm's versions, so I don't know why he bothered, but we have that one too, I guess. Man had to eat. So just like in the Search for the Missing Husband, in The Brother Who Turned into Birds, we have a female heroine who's driven to protect what's hers. Both of these story types are pretty small samples. They show that there are fairy tales that grant their female characters their own agency. These women are not passive characters. They take action in order to protect their loved ones. But none of this is to say that fairy tales are egalitarian. Stories centering men and stories centering women do not treat them in the same way. For one, I couldn't find any female trickster types, which is a shame and something we need to rectify, but more towards the point are the motivations. So when you think about the stock fairy tale opening of a young man or youngest brother who's seeking out to seek his fortune, that is a male protagonist. Female fairy tale protagonists don't go out to seek their own fortunes. They go on behalf of their husbands, or brothers, or at the request of their elderly mothers. The hero and heroine might meet a similar assortment of mysterious, gift-endowing old people along the road, but they're there for different reasons. The hero is there for himself, the heroine is there for someone else. It's not really a difference in ability. Both of them are capable, but the difference is in motivation. The hero is his own, the heroine is her family's. This is something I've noticed in a lot of older literary traditions, not just fairy tales, and I imagine it's a reflection of reality. Even now, there's an expectation for women to serve and look after their families, especially in more collectivist cultures like the ones these stories would have originated in. But from within the limits of these familial roles, female heroines are active figures who exert quite a bit of power. And it's a power that I respect because it's how a lot of women have historically wielded power. They might not ever have been at the helm because they weren't allowed to be, but they had a support role that was integral but was never acknowledged. And I think a lack of understanding of this kind of power is the biggest reason that I find fault with modern retellings. Instead of acknowledging what was already there and building on, they seem to take a corrective role. They're going to fix the narrative by applying newer, better standards to it. If you look back at my initial characterization of the subverted heroine, her emotions are focused on. She's loud, she can punch a guy. These things can make her seem more powerful, but if she still doesn't have any agency in the story itself, they're cheap and superficial. Giving a heroine a romantic arc that she's enthusiastic about, or the ability to punch a guy, as a way to distract the audience from the fact that her role in the story is still passive, is a cheap shortcut. The structural issue is still there. I do think there are ways to adapt or evolve the fairy tale heroine without mischaracterizing her foremothers. Ways that are responses to things that actually happen in fairy tales. For example, when you look at that pattern of noble, driven, self-sacrificial behavior that you see in The Search for the Lost Husband and The Sister of the Birds, I'm noticing male family members, brothers, husbands. There could be something interesting about taking that duty and devotion and supplanting it onto a female fairy member and supplanting it onto a female family member, like a mother or daughter or sister. This would be a great way to use a storyline that already appears in fairy tales to explore the bonds between women. In the same vein, but going a step further, I'd love to see a fairy tale heroine go out to seek her own fortune instead of someone else's. Either by giving her a self-oriented goal to work on from the very beginning, kind of putting her in the position of a male fairy tale protagonist, or by having her come to the realization that she has the option to be her own champion. Like, hey, I don't have to only do these things for other people. I can also do them for myself. That'd be a fun way to do some meta commentary. Making the heroine aware that she's not really supposed to go after her own goals and then having her do it anyway. This is the point at which I could pull out examples and say who did it right and wrong, and I have opinions on this. But even if I were comfortable acting as the final authority on the quality of adaptations, I would want to dissect these examples in a lot of detail, and I just don't have the time right now. Perhaps someday I will. I'd be happy to elaborate if anyone's curious. But even if I did have the time to dissect examples one by one, it'd kind of be pointless. Because I'm not trying to say that there's a wrong and right way to write a retelling, just that retellings have been prioritizing one approach while neglecting others. Fairy tale heroines are a lot more active than we give them credit for, and the stories they appear in are diverse. Writing about fairy tales when you're under the assumption that the women in them are passive and powerless betrays a limited understanding of the genre. We've had quite a few feisty, sassy princesses, and there's a reason that they were embraced so fervently for so long. I think that there's room for writers to return to the source stories and start getting more creative with them. I really love fairy tales, and I hope to keep seeing retellings that respect the source material. If not, I guess I still have all of Grimm's to fall back on. There's quite a bit of it. Okay, one last thing. Like I briefly mentioned, there's another very important thing that I couldn't find, even though I scrolled the archives, and even the cesspits. There is not a single female trickster. There's a couple where it's like, if you squint and turn sideways, maybe they count, but that's not enough. For those unaware, the trickster is like a mischievous, immoral kind of figure like the Sly Fox, or Brer Rabbit, or I think the raven and the coyote in a lot of Native American mythology. They appear in basically every tradition or culture because I guess one of the constants of humanity is that we enjoy a funky little guy who messes things up mischievously, but not maliciously. Actually, this explains humanity's relationship with cats really well. I think that the lack of female tricksters is a grave injustice. We have had enough funky little guys. Where are my funky girls? Don't little girls everywhere deserve to look up to a wet, pathetic court jester who jingle-jangles her way across the floor? Trickster types have a lot of raw appeal. I think someone needs to do their part and write about a girl trickster. for feminism. Also, everyone say hi to my frog. I knit him. His name is Frug. Okay, this is reminding me of when I was graduating college. And they make you wait in these really long lines for like hours, and so the girls behind me were playing Kiss, Marry, Kill, but like the non-PG version of Kiss, Marry, Kill. And I was eavesdropping because, like, what else did I have to do? They were doing themed editions. They did Pirate, Skeleton, Mermaid for Pirate Edition, and then they did Vampire, Elf, Werewolf for Fantasy Edition, and then they did Medieval Edition. They did Knight, King, Peasant, and so I turned around to join this conversation that no one asked me to join, but to be fair, college is kind of like that. I went, what about the court jester? And all three of the girls went, court jester. Not to say that the trickster type and the court jester are like inherently the same thing, but there's definitely overlap, and part of the overlap is the magnetism. Anyway, fairy tales.